My name is Andrew Regalado, and I'm the Country First National Grassroots Director. We're honored that you've taken some time to join us tonight for our Innovative Ideals Campfire. Tonight, we're going to explore together some political innovations that aim to make America's politics better and a better reflection of America's ideals. Too many people have checked out of politics entirely because often they're most reflected on the worst of us rather than the best of us. Country First believes that things can be done differently, but not only that things can be done differently, but things have to be done differently if we're going to preserve democracy for future generations. And that's why here at Country First, we welcome all reasonable people of goodwill, many of whom feel politically homeless in today's political environment. While we may not all agree on policy or politics, we're all bound by the belief that we must put country before party and that we're Americans before anything else. Tonight, you're going to hear from Congressman Adam Kinzinger himself, and you're also going to hear about some experts that are going to share with us about the political innovations that we're going to explore tonight. So, without further ado, please welcome Congressman, Lieutenant Colonel, member of the January 6th House Select Committee, Adam Kinzinger.
Hey, everybody. Thank you. It's good to see everybody. I had to switch to my iPhone, so I don't know what the setup's looking like, but my iPad died, which always happens at the wrong time. So thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you for participating. Look, I want to talk just quickly about, the fact that there's so much news that comes at us every day, and particularly when we talk about the former president, the investigations going on, this thing now in New York. Sometimes it can be overwhelming. Sometimes we can sit around and be like, well, what's gonna happen? It's out of our control. And a lot of that is with the Department of Justice. But what's important here is that we recognize and remember that no one is above the law. And it doesn't matter if you're Republican, Democrat, somewhere in between. It's that rule of law, which is essential to give us all a playing field so that we can govern ourselves. As probably you've been watching, if you're paying attention to what I tweet about, it's been a lot of focus on Ukraine. It's something I'm very passionate about, watching the Russian Federation just attack for the sole purpose of a power grab, to tell a group of people that they don't exist as an identity. And the Ukrainians have said no. And it's as I say all the time, it's so inspiring to me that in this tragic situation, watching the Ukrainians stand up and fight for freedom, fight for self-governance at a time where every day it feels like we're just sitting around doing our best to destroy ours. And so on the January 6th stuff, on the preservation of democracy, we have another hearing next week on the 28th at 1 p.m. Eastern time. I hope you guys can tune in to see that as we begin to wrap up our version of the investigation with our report on recommendations, what we can do, what's been done. And with that, that's the role of Congress, to tell you the story. And it really seems like DOJ has picked up the baton on the criminal side of things. So again, we'll see where that goes. Same thing with the classified documents. But I want to say to all of you, serving on that committee has been an honor. It's not been the easiest thing I've ever done. But I think when I look back at my 12 years in Congress, it will be the most important thing. One of the other most important things, I think, is this creation of Country First. And again, it's been so amazing to me to watch. This isn't me kind of top down saying what I want or what I think. It's really happened organically. The number of members we have, the number of volunteer staff that are putting hours and hours into this, and just going out and doing what's the hard work. So a friend of mine, his name's Scott, if you guys know Rooftop, Scott Mann, he's the one that basically just wrote a new book called Operation Pineapple Express, I think. But he always talks about how in the 20s and 30s, there was a real distrust in government. Society was at each other's throats. And out of that kind of lack of leadership rose things like Alcoholics Anonymous and Lions Club and those community service type organizations that survive today. And what that reminds me a lot of, frankly, what we're seeing in Country First. It's people that don't agree. And listen, this isn't about us getting together to argue politics. There's plenty of time to argue issues. This is about us coming together to try to figure out what we can do, not just in current issues, but things that are going to come up. How do we work together again? How do we put our country first? And most importantly, how do we do things like calling out toxic tribalism, calling out the abuse that is being done through fundraising? And so today I'm excited about all this, to have everybody here, to have everybody together. And I appreciate everybody that's involved with this. But I want you to think through today and all through the future. You know, conservatism or liberalism, libertarianism, there was a point in time at which the day before that never existed as a thought. So basically people came forward and came up with conservative ideas or liberal ideas. I want us all together to find new solutions to these problems, some which we may never have even thought about, because that's the next jump for this country. It's not going to be arguing the same stuff and the same solutions. We've tried all of that. It's going to be this ground up, innovative, like energy and excitement. So I want to thank you for being part of that. The last thing I want to say too is this. One of the best things about Country First that people have told me is it's just recognizing that there are other people like you out there. I always say I feel politically homeless, and I do right now. I feel like I don't have a party I belong to. And that can be very isolating. It can make you feel very alone until you realize there are thousands and thousands of people that think like me. And I'm not talking policy or solutions, but also feel politically homeless and feel like something has to happen. We are going to be the force that makes that change. That when we look back in history, we can say, my goodness, yeah, stuff was pretty rough before that. And then we had this just flourishing new ideas. So I'm excited about that. I want to say to everybody, thank you for taking your time. I know your time is precious, and so we won't waste that. So with that, I'll kick it over to who's next. I think it's Riley.
That's right. Thank you very much for that introduction. And what I'm going to do is I'm about to introduce the people who are going to we're going to be learning alongside tonight, or they're going to be teaching us. And the way to start that off is for us to think about how we got to this poisonous, toxic politics. And one might think that our politicians are simply a reflection of our people. But what Country First would argue is that our politicians are actually a reflection of the 5 to 10% of people who vote in primary elections. And those people tend to be a lot more partisan and a lot more extreme than everyday Americans. Now, not all of them, but disproportionately compared to the general electorate. And that's true in both Republican and Democratic districts, the data shows. And so these voters often don't want compromise. They don't want collaboration. They don't want our leaders to work together. They demand purity, and they'll vote against anyone who doesn't promise it or any incumbent who doesn't deliver it. And guess what? These leaders or these voters elect folks in the primary who fall in line. That becomes the incentive to win, to be pure, to not collaborate, to not compromise. And this is why so many people say that the general election feels like there are no good choices or that they must pick the lesser of two evils. But what's incredible about our country and what's really set us apart throughout our history is our ability to innovate. We've never met a problem we couldn't solve, but we have lacked politicians with the will to do it. Now, we'll admit Country First is not the expert at all political innovations, especially the ones we're exploring tonight. And that's why we have some experts here joining us. But what we do know is that the system as it's working right now is failing us. It's keeping us from solving problems. Each election cycle is nastier than the one before, and the division is alienating us from our friends, our families, our communities, our workplaces, our churches, and beyond. So when Country First learned about a simple set of reforms that incentivize the best in our leaders, we paid attention. Innovations to our system that reward being reasonable, reward collaboration, reward politeness and respect, and reward telling people the truth. We're not saying these innovations will solve all our problems, that there aren't other good ideas out there, or that we can even get any of these passed overnight if we wanted to. But we do know that all of us here tonight have gathered to hear how things can be different, because we all know, I think, that they must be different if we're going to keep our democracy. So while no solution is perfect, this is a pretty good place to start. And that's just what Country First is doing. We're just getting started. So thank you for coming tonight. We look forward to learning from tonight's presentation alongside you. And now Andrew will introduce our speakers.
Thanks so much, Riley. I'm excited to learn alongside all of y'all tonight as well. Just, to think about innovations to our electoral system. But before we get to in, I see some of y'all already found the chat. If you haven't yet, please let us know where you're calling in from. This is a national movement in all 50 states, and we'd love to know who's here tonight. Additionally, if you have questions during tonight's presentation, please also feel free to drop them in the chat. Folks here at the Country First HQ will be happy to provide links and make sure to address as many of them as we can tonight. But let's get to it. Without further ado, please welcome Todd Connor and Eric Bronner from Veterans for Political Innovation.
All right. Good evening, everybody. And Andrew and Riley, and especially Congressman Kinzinger, thank you so much for your leadership, your patriotism. I also just want to acknowledge everyone who's on this call, taking time out of your evening to join in the conversation about how we repair this country that we all love so deeply. So I come to you as a founder of Veterans for Political Innovation. I also come to you as a member of Country First. And so we're just very honored to be with you tonight. I'll introduce my co-founder as well, Eric Bronner, who you'll hear from in a moment. What we want to do is set the stage for a conversation about Final Five voting, which is a combination of open primaries and ranked choice voting. And we'll get into the technicalities of what this is. And really, we want you to feel equipped to be conversant, to talk about Final Five voting or Final Four voting, and this combination of ranked choice voting and open primaries, which we believe is very powerful. But before we get into the sort of the technical application of these measures, I want to start by talking about the power of election reform. Speaking for myself, just by way of background, I started an organization several years ago to help military veterans start businesses, an organization called Bunker Labs. And as a Navy veteran myself, and as an entrepreneur, and then coaching entrepreneurs and working with entrepreneurs, I was confronted daily with the power of innovation. And as someone who's also a political observer, I was always struck with this dichotomy of seeing amazing things happening by veterans and entrepreneurs in cities across this country, and then the sort of paralyzing dysfunction that we witnessed with the sort of the two-party system, the duopoly. And it always struck me as a systems problem. I read a book by Catherine Gale and Michael Porter. I'll acknowledge it here, which really codified, crystallized a lot of what I knew to be true, but framed the challenge that we're facing in a business context. Michael Porter is sort of the godfather of competitive strategy and frames a lot of complex business problems in the context of marketplace. And he talked about the two-party system as being really, in many ways, a flawed marketplace. And it's sort of that simple. And to solve it, you have to change the marketplace. And we'll get into how you can do that. I want to just affirm that what we're going through now as a country is not cyclical. It's not normal. It's not self-correcting. The data that you can see here, the visualization, this reflects voting patterns of members of Congress. And of course, it's only gotten worse since 2011, right? Which we all know. And so this is not a self-correcting cycle. The United States today ranks, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit's annual democracy index, we're ranked as a flawed democracy. We're on par with Chile, 26, except Chile is getting better and we are on the decline. When our own experts in democracy from the United States go and consult foreign governments on how to strengthen and implement democratic systems, we avoid recommendations that lead to the kind of polarization that we are experiencing now as a country. And so we are left in this place where we know something's deeply broken, and we see, in addition to this, alarming statistics around a significant voting block of both Biden and Trump supporters talking about the situation being so untenable that they would consider seceding from the Union to form independent countries. So these are dangerous conditions, but there's reason for optimism because this doesn't reflect what is the growing segment in this country, which is independent voters, especially young people who recognize that the situation is untenable. So let's go to the next slide. You know, and again, this is why we're all on this call, because we know that something better is possible. We know that something better must happen. There's lots of data around this, but growing percentages of voters want to see the two-party system just function differently. They know that the federal government isn't working in ways that it needs to. And sadly, 70% of Americans agree with the statement that America has become so polarized that it can no longer solve the major issues facing this country. And so if your entering point for this conversation is a passion around budget reform or the situation in Ukraine or climate action or any issue that's your pet issue, education, funding, and policy, our argument is unless we deal with the systems that get us the politics, we cannot deal with the issues at hand. We're in this paralyzing state. And so we have to deal with the machinery of politics, the election systems themselves, if we actually want to get to a place where we can, in fact, have productive policy making. Let's go to the next slide. There's the good news. There are election innovations, which my colleague here, my friend Eric, is going to get us into, that really immediately can shift the incentives. Final five voting. Just go to the chat. If you've heard of Final Five voting or Final Four voting, I'd love a reaction on that. If you haven't, you've maybe heard of ranked choice voting, or maybe you've heard of instant runoff elections, or maybe you've heard of open primaries or semi-open primaries. But here's the situation. This country, a lot of folks don't realize this. Every state conducts their elections differently. Every state has authority to determine how to conduct their elections. And to solve the national and federal crisis of polarization, you actually have to focus on what the states are doing and how the states are conducting their elections. We talk about the United States as being a great opportunity for experimentation, the laboratory of democracy, as it was called. And so we have an opportunity to look at states like Maine and most recently Alaska, and we're going to get into the case study of Alaska to understand what some of the controlled experiments that are being run in states that are immediately having an effect on polarization. And if we can understand those experiments and then scale those experiments, we can solve polarization. We can deal with this crisis. And it's not going to come out of Washington, D.C. These solutions are going to happen because people are going to organize in states to take action and either initiate ballot initiatives in states that have that mechanism, or go to their state legislatures and lobby those folks and talk to those folks and ask and insist on better election systems that ultimately increase representation and reflect the values of who we are as Americans and the kind of politics that we want. This is a really sad statistic, which is that despite a record turnout in the 2020 general election, only 10% of eligible Americans nationwide cast ballots in primary elections that effectively decided the winners in 83% of congressional seats. And this just ties back to what Riley said, which is it's a math problem ultimately. And as long as we have people running in partisan primaries, trying to win a narrow election with a small number of voters that only appeal to their ideological base, we're going to have this math problem. And this only gets extrapolated and exacerbated because most districts are gerrymandered. So most districts are gerrymandered, meaning most elections are determined in the primary. And if you change that, you really open up competition in a way that's pretty immediate and pretty profound. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric Bronner, a fellow Navy veteran, to talk us through what Final Five voting is. And let's take a look at Alaska and what that election has meant for us.
Thanks so much, Todd and the Country First team. Congressman Kinzinger, we're honored to be here and grateful for this opportunity. And as a self-described political reform nerd, it's a joy for me to dive into the details of Alaska and how America's last frontier can be the new frontier for political innovations for all of us. So real quick, what's going on? What just happened in Alaska and how did we get here? In 2020, Alaska voters passed a ballot initiative, which about half of our states have and half of our states don't, to institute something called a top 4 open primary and ranked choice voting. And to get a little technical, it's a ranked choice ballot that you're looking at. It doesn't look very complicated to me. And that powers an instant runoff, which we're going to go into here in a minute. But so in 2020, Alaska voters passed this innovative new system. And in 2022, it was going to be used for the first time this fall. However, in the interim, sadly, longtime serving Congressman Don Young passed away in March. And by Alaska's laws, they had to hold a special election to fill out the remainder of his term. The primary for the special election took place in June up in Alaska. There were 48 candidates running on one ballot. That's an open primary. The first round of voting, all candidates are on one ballot, regardless of party, including a man who was legally named Santa Claus. He did not finish in the top 4. However, there were the top 4 finishers, and we can go to the next slide here, were Nick Begich, a Republican, Sarah Palin, a Republican, and Mary Pelota, a Democrat, along with Al Gross, who was formerly a Democrat turned independent. Al Gross dropped out of the race. So these 4 folks finished in the top 4, but Al Gross dropped out. And so there was a line for a write-in candidate. And in the first round of voting in Alaska, these were the results. And so on that, the previous slide that shows exactly how a ranked choice ballot would look, what happened was you had about 40% chose Mary Pelota as their first choice, 31% Sarah Palin, 28% Nick Begich. That was the first place votes. But what this new system did was it gave voters the option. You could rank 1 or you could rank 3. And if you ranked 3, what happens is if no one gets over 50% of the first place votes, there's an instant runoff. And that's exactly what happened up in Alaska. There was an instant runoff. No one got over 50%. So in the second round, which is the next slide, what happened is about 50% of Nick Begich's voters chose Sarah Palin as their second choice, but about 15% chose Mary Pelota, the Democrat, as their second choice. And so their votes, any of the Nick Begich voters who picked him first, their votes were transferred to the second choice. And that is what resulted in Mary Pelota winning the Alaska election. So those are the mechanics of how it worked. And we can get into greater detail in the breakout rooms if you have questions. But for example, Ireland has used the system for over 100 years. They call it the single transferable vote, because what happens is if your first choice finishes last, your vote gets transferred to your second choice until someone's over 50%. Hopefully that's clear. The ballot is very simple, and what we found in the next slide is that the Alaska voters really loved this new system. I got one slide ahead of myself, I apologize. So in this slide here, you'll see that 85% said that ranked choice voting was easy to use. And that Alaskans, 62% of Alaskans liked their new primary system. So it was very popular. What we're most excited about is how this new system changes incentives. How does it change incentives? It now makes the winner responsible to a majority of their constituents. Elected officials now will have the freedom to respond to what a majority of their constituents want, not just the small section of their base that comes out in the primary election. So these new incentives are having immediate impact up in Alaska. Immediately after this special election, Sarah Palin was quick to post photos of her and her opponents. Why would she do that? Well, because there's going to be another election in Alaska using the same system in November, and Sarah Palin is in that race again. And so she's demonstrating that this new innovative system can have an immediate result in more positive campaigning, more collaborative campaigning amongst candidates. And we're really excited about what it can do for the rest of the country. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Todd.
All right, thanks, Eric. And really, I just want to make a few really important points. Here's the point in terms of Alaska or any election where ranked choice voting is applied. People don't win unless they have broad appeal. And that's the point of this election system. And voters are able to express more specific preferences. You know, when you go to vote and there's an R and a D, what we hear all the time is that people are doing the lesser of two evil voting. They're not necessarily happy with the choices, but they're voting for the choice that they like the least. And to diverge from politics for a minute, this is really just a simple decision theory. This is behavioral decision psychology, which any of you that have been to business school have studied this. This is like kind of 101 stuff, which is if you only have two options, the quickest decision path is not to convince people why you're good. It's to convince people why the other thing is bad. It's like the old joke about two people sitting at a campsite, since we're in a campfire here, and a bear approaches them, and the one guy starts to run. He says, "Hey, dummy, you can't outrun a bear." And he says, "I don't have to outrun a bear. I just have to outrun you." That's sort of the nature of a two option decision paradigm. If you think about Coke and Pepsi in the 90s, they led with negative advertising because they operated on this kind of arrogant assumption that everyone's going to drink soda, and it's just a question of whether it's Coke or Pepsi. So if we just convince you not to like Pepsi, then you're going to like Coke. Well, as soon as you introduce flavored waters or other options, that whole theory, that whole strategy of negative campaigning, it just ceases to be effective. It ceases to be strategic. And that's where you look at the behavior of a candidate like Sarah Palin, who plans to run again and very well may win in the next election. If she does, it's going to be predicated on her ability to capture more of a general election vote from independents and Democrats who will express her as either their first or second choice or third choice. So that's the power of this, is that it opens up optionality and it allows voters to express not only one choice, which is typically a lesser of two evils, but a second and third choice. And as a result, that field, right, begins to sort of coalesce amongst itself and figure out what is it that voters want and how do I appeal to what it is that voters are expressing. There are some common myths that are out there, and you're going to hear these. And so we just want to acknowledge them and kind of give you some data, which is that ranked choice voting is confusing. It's not confusing. And if you look at that ballot, it's a simple sort of Scantron. It's 4 options with bubbles. We know from voters that use ranked choice voting in New York City's mayoral election, where they chose Eric Adams. We know from the Virginia Republican convention, in which they selected Glenn Youngkin. We know from Democratic caucuses in which they use ranked choice voting. It is not confusing. We know from the exit polling out of Alaska that voters found it to be simple. So it's not confusing. It can be hard to explain, I'll acknowledge that, but when voters are looking at the ballot and they see it, it's very intuitive as to how to vote. You see options and you pick your options, you rank them. The second myth that you'll hear sometimes is that this disenfranchises voters. And we also know that this is not true. And there's lots of data to back this up. In the case of New York City, they increased their voter turnout by about 30% in their last mayoral election using ranked choice voting. They got their second African-American mayor in that city's history. They got the most diverse city council that they've ever had. And they elected a mayor who's arguably more moderate, former police officer, right? Who represents a value set that had a broader appeal to the majority of New Yorkers, and a candidate who probably would not have won a closed primary election. That plays out in Maine, where they have ranked choice voting. That also plays out in Alaska, where you saw a record turnout for this past election, which is all the more exceptional considering it's a special election and it was a primary election. So we're seeing an increase in voter turnout. We're seeing an increase in the diversity of the voters, not to mention, and this is why we're so passionate about this work, but a majority of military veterans identify as independent voters. So they are structurally disenfranchised if they cannot vote in a closed primary election. In the case of Pennsylvania, for example, where you have closed primaries, if you're not a registered Republican or a registered Democrat, you can't vote in those primaries. And when you live in a gerrymandered district, if you're not voting in the primary, you're not really voting. You really don't have a say. And so we need to center the disenfranchisement argument on independents and folks that aren't able to participate or have their preferences expressed. And then the third myth is that this favors one party over another. There's a lot of ink being spilled right now about what Alaska has meant. Some Republicans have come out to say this is therefore a bad system because Mary Peltola has been elected. And I apologize, I think we had a typo on her name in the last slide. But so there's this argument that somehow this is a ruse and this is going to help Democrats. It's really not. And what you see is in places like Nevada, you're seeing opposition from the Democratic Party and typically opposition from wherever the power structure is being held, whether it's Republicans or Democrats. Similarly, you're seeing this this movement seated in places that are historically Republican and Democrat. So this is a cross-partisan effort where you're seeing opposition from Republicans and Democrats and advocacy from Republicans and Democrats. And in Alaska, it's very likely that Lisa Murkowski, who's the incumbent Republican, she's going to win in using this same election system. So we're going to see more candidates out of both parties that are understanding how to use the system, and ultimately who it favors are candidates that appeal more broadly to the public. Let's go to the next slide. This movement is taking hold, and there's a great research from a variety of partners that we work with about how this is unfolding throughout the country. There are a number of citizen initiatives and actions at the municipal level, at the state level, for other segmented parts of our society to figure out how to implement versions of this. And so if one of the things that we know as a change process is that, you know, change, especially big national change that has to happen state by state, and we know this from other voting measures or from other civil rights efforts, it happens very slowly at first on calls like this one, right? Where you and early adopters come together, good-hearted people that are thinking clearly about the problem, you know, operating in a spirit of curiosity. It feels technical, it feels like a sideshow until it's not. Until a movement like this captures the hearts and imaginations of Americans. And pretty soon, like any major change, it happens very slowly until it happens very quickly. And we think that Final Five voting and election reform is the kind of issue like the filibuster, where a few people understood, like many of you on this call, what it meant and have understood it for a long time. But it wasn't until more recently that it's captured the national imagination. People actually have a working understanding of it. We think people can come to have a working understanding of primaries, the problem with primaries, and how we can fix them. And as these communities like St. Paul or Portland or Payson, Utah, as they explore this, it invites the communities around them to explore this conversation as well. And as one state adopts these measures, it invites other states to begin to have a conversation about, hey, look at what Utah did. Do we like the way that we're doing elections, right? And we really think that that's the theory of change that we can have here. What we also know is that when voters get a taste of ranked choice voting or a Final Five voting model, if they get that anywhere on their ballot, they quickly want it everywhere on their ballot, because it ceases to be intuitive. If it's like, if I can rank the preferences for who's running for mayor, why am I limited then when it comes to voting for the US Senate? So we really support advocacy for these efforts at the local level, because if voters get a taste of this anywhere on their ballot, they want it everywhere on their ballot. Let's go to the next slide. And some other things that are really interesting is that all of the parties, major parties, Democrat, Republican, Green Party, and Libertarian, they use ranked choice voting in parts of their party election process. And I talked about Virginia. The Democratic Party will use it for their Nevada caucus. And so parties are actually using this in different places around the country. Legislation to support or implement ranked choice voting is being considered in nearly half of US states, with sponsors, Republicans and Democrats, often military veterans, who want to cut past the noise and say, look, this is no longer fun. This is no longer working. We need to actually address solutions. Interestingly, it's also used by overseas and military voters in places with runoff elections in another 5 southern states, so southeastern southern states, because the time lag doesn't allow for secondary ballots to be printed and mailed over and returned. So part of the argument we have is that if it's good enough for the military community and for veterans, it ought to be good enough for the public at large. Ranked choice voting is also used in over 50 colleges and universities to elect student government officers. It's used in lots of corporate boardrooms. It's recommended by Robert's Rules of Order as to how to make a good decision as a corporate organization to drive consensus. It's probably how, if you work at a company and you're taking a lunch order, you take the lunch order. It's like, what's your first choice? And by the way, if they run out of that, what's the second choice? Let's order something for lunch that the most people can agree with, right? It's sort of an intuitive thing. Other countries, including 6 countries in particular, have implemented ranked choice voting. Interestingly, 3 of the top 10 healthiest democracies in the world use ranked choice voting for their federal elections. And so there's a direct correlation on ranked choice voting. Our own democracy experts that we send abroad, they recommend ranked choice voting as a means to not find ourselves in the peril that we find ourselves in today as a country here. And if you want to have fun, the Academy Awards and the Oscars, they also use ranked choice voting in nominating and selecting winners for their prestigious awards. So this is a known voting method. It's just new to many of us. So where do we go from here? Well, there's a lot of opportunities on the horizon. We've talked about Alaska. We've talked about Maine. We've talked about New York City. We've given you a lot of locations. Here's where we're going to be focused as an organization. And we invite you all to join us, and we'll talk about how to do that. Nevada has a ballot initiative that will go before the voters in November. Both parties have lodged some opposition to this, but the citizens have put forward a ballot initiative, and there is a groundswell of support. So that's happening. And if Nevada comes forward and passes this ballot initiative along with Alaska and Maine, you know, what's so interesting about that is now you've got 6 US senators who are operating with a fundamentally different incentive structure than their Republican and Democratic peers. And those 6 will represent a voting bloc in which they can come together in a consensus-driven way and really be the power center for the United States Senate, insist on productive legislation moving forward, stop unproductive efforts from moving forward. And so it's pretty powerful. You don't have to win a majority of states for this kind of reform to have a dramatic and outsized impact on the American political system or on the United States Senate or the United States House of Representatives. You just need a critical minority mass for this to have a real impact. So we have a chapter meeting on October 6th to talk about volunteer opportunities. Eric and I will share our emails, but we would love for you to stay engaged with us. But that's really front burner for this movement is Nevada. Pennsylvania, there's active legislation in the state legislature to repeal closed primaries, and there's a number of co-sponsors on that. So like I said, you know, independent voters, military veterans who aren't registered can't vote in those primaries. And again, that's the state, like most states, in which the districts are gerrymandered. So they're functionally excluded. So join us if you want to support the Ballot Pennsylvania initiative. We have an event on September 30th. Wisconsin, there's an active bill with about 20 co-sponsors, Republicans and Democrats, to implement Final Five voting in the state of Wisconsin. And that'll be through legislative action. So about half the states in this country can do a ballot initiative. About half the states will have to address this through a legislative action through the state legislature. But that bill is pending in Wisconsin. And then there's other campaigns, which you can see here in Oklahoma, Georgia, California, New York, and then a number of ballot initiatives that'll be percolating for the year 2024. I will say this, a number of serious funders, Republicans and Democrats, are coming together like all of us and saying, what's the path out? How do we restore some sense of sanity, stability to this country that we love? And these movement efforts are catching hold, and very serious people are looking at this and paying attention and saying, it's maybe not a silver bullet, but it certainly changes things immediately in places like Alaska and places like Maine. And if we can scale this effort, I think it's going to be a great thing for our country. On the other side of this, we're going to have a strong, arguably stronger Republican and Democratic Party. This is not about upending those parties. This is not about getting rid of party identity. This is, in fact, about strengthening the parties and maybe even inviting more parties into the process by voters' honest opinions being expressed at the ballot box. And if we can do that, I think we can have a significant impact on the future of this country. So with that, I'll just say thank you again to Country First and to Congressman Kinzinger for your leadership on hosting this conversation and for all of your courage. We're honored to be a part of this movement along with you and with everyone on this call. Thank you for your time and attention tonight, and we're looking forward to the conversation that will follow.